Hello, my name is Vinita Shetty, and I'm the organizer of Placemaking India Week. We were founded about 6 months ago, and we're one of the 14 regional networks of Placemaking X in New York, from all around the world. We are the youngest. And this meeting is it's one of the accidental benefits of confinement due to COVID. And Zoom has become a platform for collective learning. And so here we are on Urban Jam, which you call Urban Jam. It's an experience we're sharing with the Indic placemaking diaspora. So with placemakers from all over the world. And last week a fortnight ago rather, we had Anupam Yog, who kicked it off. He's with the National University of uh, Singapore, and he gave us a very good, sort of very nuanced discussion on how placemaking in India differs from urban, tactical urbanism in the US, and left us with some very good learnings. I hope that recording will be up soon. And today, I'm really pleased to have Dhanya Rajgopal from the Design Trust for Public Space in New York. And she's going to be addressing public space management and building coalition with communities and local organizations in creating and sustaining these spaces long term. She's also got some great ideas on community-based design practice, how to make that part of a mainstream educational curriculum, and on redefining the scope of the public realm as critical infrastructure in India. We are going to have this as a moderated discussion. So I'll turn over to Pavithra. Turn this over to Pavithra Sriram. She's an architect and urban planner based in Chennai. As a strong advocate for safe and inclusive streets in the last few years, she's focused her career on learning, testing, and implementing placemaking, tactical urbanism, and street design projects. She's a consultant for Street Plans, which is a multinational urban planning firm based in the US, and recently moved to India around the same time as our inaugural Placemaking Week, which was December last year. Her core work focuses on bringing her multidisciplinary and international experience to materialize on our Indian soils. And she also heads Design CoLab, an architecture and urban enterprise based in Chennai. Over to you, Pavithra.
Sure. Thanks, Vinita. I've known Dhanya as a junior joining Pratt Institute during my city planning masters there. But unfortunately, I've never had the chance to interact with her during my time in New York. As a distant observer, I've seen her work being published in college magazines, on social media platforms, and all her work experiences so far. But much recently, after 3 years of distantly knowing her, thanks to a variety of common ground in placemaking work we're all interested in collectively, in both Chennai and New York that we call home, we got chatting and we spoke over for an hour straight about plans that she has and what she wants to do here and what I'm doing here. But for everybody else, Dhanya is currently the program associate at Design Trust for Public Space, a non-profit based in New York City. She has a master's in urban placemaking and management from Pratt Institute and a bachelor's degree in architecture from Chennai. She is interested in applied research for place-based management and community-based design practices that have a long-term systemic impact. I'm excited to see what you're going to present today, and thanks for joining us. Over to you. You are on mute, Dhanya.
Thank you both for putting this together. And yeah, this is going to be, I hope, a conversation that we can have in the future post-COVID. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the anger and sort of grief that a lot of us have been feeling over the past few days of what happened in Tamil Nadu, the death of 2 men, 2 shopkeepers under police custody. And I hope this collective rage leads to greater reform and greater accountability of our elected officials and our civil servants, so that we could start to bridge these gaps and build trust through spaces or through activities. And it's going to be a long healing process, but I hope, unfortunately, it has to come to this for that to happen, but I hope it happens nevertheless. So let me just share my screen so I can present what I have. Right. So I hope everyone can see this. So today I'm going to be touching on a couple of themes that will be recurring throughout the presentation. So placemaking for productivity is something that is not only a Pratt curriculum setup, but also something that I have learned through Design Trust and working as a consultant for Agora Partners and working with Gale Institute on research. So there has been an understanding that there needs to be meaningful public engagement and not just tokenistic ones, and how we can move towards prototyping and systems change instead of just beautification of a place. And how do we move from consumptive and commodification of public space to a more ecological and socially valuable commodities? And how do we therefore look at them as like important for resiliency, recovery, and critical response? And most importantly, how can we identify our own spatial assets and social assets so that through placemaking as a practice, we can enhance them? So the bottom line is we need more space. And this is true for any city that we live in India. The per capita open space requirement that urban designers follow is 10 to 12 square meters, and clearly our cities fall short. But we don't just need space, we need safe, social, sustainable spaces that can sort of help alleviate a lot of social issues and systemic issues. So when you look at it from that perspective, it doesn't just become a public space for recreation or enjoyment, it becomes an asset or a valuable infrastructure. So speaking of assets, I want to talk about our own assets that we have in India. And we are really good at creating something out of very everyday objects. And we are natural street artists. And this is a typical way of how murals have been existing in our traditional way of living. And it's quite surprising every time you walk through a column like this, you never want to destroy that space, or you want to keep it clean. And it sort of brings that ownership aspect to space. When you take care of it, others notice it too. And our response to placemaking is quite unique because we have unique challenges of class, caste, and we have huge spaces that can be utilized to make invisible voices visible, such as this storytelling session, and how fishing communities have sort of invited people who use the beach to share their experiences. So I want this to be as interactive as possible because it's going to be a long session. So just let me know what you think is an asset or specialty in your neighborhood you live in. And this will be, you'll understand why I'm talking about this at a later time. But yeah, just feel free to add this in the chat box. The truth is more than 70% of the workforce in urban India is the informal sector. But this also means that we need to create spaces for productivity and not just consumption, but real value. So some of the projects that Conquid Design Initiative has done in LA, in Nairobi, for example, they have sort of helped build this economic vitality and environmental vitality by doing simple things like paving the road so that they can access a public space or a school, for example. So discovering assets has been a huge part of their own process. And I think having basic infrastructure and then creating these programs can actually have better impact for communities that are often left out of these area development or economic incentive zones and stuff like that. So this is a very beautiful diagram, but I just want to give an overview of how the ecosystem of management is more important than just designing a space. So after a design is done, how can the community take ownership of these spaces that are created and how can we build that social credibility or economic credibility for communities that already have these assets. And that requires multi-level stakeholder partnership. Um, and this could lead to increasing this open space index by doing things like activating streets where there are no public libraries, to bring public libraries to your neighborhood, and maybe have churches and religious spaces or spaces that can accommodate uh, other useful co-working co-working uses. So for example, this is a project we did at Pratt at Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, where there were a lot of vacant spaces and a lot of churches. But there have been examples where they have become really critical for the community for information and resource hubs. So now that you thought about the assets, think about what improvements you would like to see in your neighborhoods. And think about whether these improvements can in fact use these assets, or do they need some external help. So the one of the conversations that came up when I was speaking with Pavithra was also how when we talk about placemaking, it's almost always thought of like, okay, we do a prototype, we test it or not test it, but we just draw or paint or create some extra furniture in the street and we don't think about it afterwards. But what is really necessary for systemic changes is how we can take this pilot and evaluate them and then inform policies, and so that we get a better buy-in from the city agencies as well in being part of funding or maintaining these spaces. So a lot of the
can I just quickly interrupt this? Somebody has got their mic on. If you can just make sure your audio is turned off, so that Dhanya has all the bandwidth, because there's some disturbance in the background. Just make sure you're on mute. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of the work that I do at Design Trust comes from their model of engagement. So they work with fellows who are brought in based on a project need. So you might have a participatory art fellow, you might have a design fellow, a photography fellow, depending on the need of the project itself. And then, even though it takes time, it involves a very detailed engagement with community groups. But also during that process, it gives time to get cities to be part of this process and sign MOUs that were never signed before. And how can a pilot infrastructure become part of a citywide initiative? An example I can give is something called L Space. And this is looking at the spaces underneath elevated infrastructure and how they could become potential urban infrastructure. So this is an example of a space in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And as you can see, it's not just the space that has been converted for a pilot, but what it has created is the opportunity to look at urban infrastructure differently and how stormwater drain can become part of, to catch the runoff from the flyover above, and how planters and lighting can make it safer. And we have seen this in India too. So we have seen these spot fixes that happened in Bangalore and other cities. But what I would like to see is the potential of these spaces to become more permanent policies, and maybe it could inform better practice and incentives for local businesses or local institutions to take part in this process and take ownership of this process. That brings me to the missing ingredient in our smart cities. So one of the reasons that the term placemaking can become sort of this bridging the gap is in public participation, and then also testing out these large scale urban infrastructure projects, which are going to take a lot of money, time, and effort. So look at micro initiatives that can have a greater impact. And for example, during COVID and even before, there have been ways in which art has become a way to build community visibility, and it has become a way to change the narrative of a neighborhood as crime-ridden, as, you know, a slum, to a more productive public space. And they have been doing amazing work in Kanaginagar with sustainable micro enterprises with women, and tackling crime using just basic engagement. And that is really like changing the viewpoint of how an outsider view these spaces and how can they become part of these spaces. This is like very important, because when we talk about managing and local assets, we need to remember that place-based partnership can become a vital role in the recovery and resilience of our cities. And the reason why this is important is most of my understanding of placemaking at TRAT came from how do we build a map to see what are the assets of a space that are not just institutional, but like local grassroots organizations, and how can they be part of this collective movement? Because in a lot of times they have the knowledge and the know-how to know what works in their neighborhood and what does not. And that brings to how productivity can become a critical aspect of our public realm. So critical infrastructure is globally defined as the body of systems, networks, and assets that are so essential that their continued operation is required to ensure the security of a given nation, its economy, and the public health or safety. If this definition applies, then I think public spaces and public realm or streets are all part of the critical infrastructure, because they have been necessary for public health, emergency resilience. They have been spaces where playgrounds have been converted into markets, or defunct stations have been converted into vegetable and meat selling areas. So I think the whole aspect of why do we only spend 2.3% of our smart city missions to health and education, while we could actually be integrating health and education as part of our area development, as part of our urban transport, as part of our water supply, as part of non-motorized and safety measures. So I think this conversation has to come to the forefront, because if a space is not safe, if it is not equitably accessible, then no amount of area development is going to really make a difference. So when we think about moving from a normal to a more forward post-COVID world, we need to think about infrastructure in a different way, and how infrastructure can in fact balance what we already have. Not even saying create more spaces, but we have a lot of spaces that are underused, that can be put to better use. So one of the examples that I read was from WRI, and they had this idea of having shared use agreements for spaces where you can currently have the system of, you know, local markets or local businesses have spaces to accommodate in these playgrounds or rooftops, for example. And maybe that can be a longer term thing to consider instead of confining them in one multi-story space. And it can, when you think about resilience, it's also about the digital divide and how public spaces can help build it. In one of the projects we did in Cuba, we realized that everyone was using public spaces at one point of the day, because that was the time when Wi-Fi was working in the public spaces, and a lot of students who could not access them at their house were able to access it by going to the nearest plaza or going to the nearest park. And when we think about working from home, we really missed out on how this can really affect a lot of our population. I'm showing you an example of a power map, or like a coalition map that we did for a plaza. So the Central Business District has access to so many different community organizations, educational institutions, that if they could think of bringing them on board to help program the space, maybe fund the space, create marketing materials for the space, technically it sort of reduces this burden on the cities itself to sort of do everything on their own. And in this way, it makes these spaces more vital and not just another, you know, elite idea of what beautification is. And the good news is the Union Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry has agreed with me and has said that recently put out a statement saying that planning for pedestrian-friendly market space may be done in consultation with the stakeholders, vendors, and municipal officers. And this is going to happen until September this year. And this is also a public health emergency, and it's finally bringing to the forefront what people have been telling for decades, increase sidewalks. It's not just about beautification, but it's also about different uses so that we don't have to scurry when the time is really running short. So I was reading a lot of articles on how different playgrounds and public spaces, because parks in our cities are like full of grass, and it's not really the best for having spaces like, markets or like have tables and things like that. So they found school playgrounds to be a better option to have markets. And this is something you can notice throughout the country as well. Our streets have become queues now where people actually use it for standing, and social distance apart. I think this picture is sort of symbolic of how we could reimagine our streets to become more pedestrian friendly. And I'm just going to leave you with this last database that I've been collecting, and I might need your help for this in the future going forward. So it just got me curious to know what kind of spaces throughout the city have been converted to critical infrastructure. And it was interesting to say that the stadiums, which we use once in every couple of days, have become, like temporary clinics and facilities for coronavirus sanitization or like safety. And food distribution has been taking place throughout streets, and a lot of these railway systems have like converted into coaches for quarantine facilities. So this is an ongoing database that I've been collecting, and as you can see, it's city based and it's area based. So you can also help me with this, with policies or with supportive organizations that have been doing this work. So that's my plug. And hopefully this can lead to some conversation that is more longer term, and maybe it can become a more visual and accessible report later. And yeah, that brings me to the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhanya. Thank you for your presentation. I can see somebody has raised their hand. Do you have any questions? Anybody who has questions who have not posted on the chat group yet, or do you want to discuss the public space aspect of it that Dhanya mentioned? Any particular examples that you can think of in your neighborhood that you'd want to share with everybody else?
I
can probably
have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Which is not particularly related to what you mentioned or the last part of. First of all, thank you so much for a really nice presentation. I think it really syncs to a lot of things we have been thinking in terms of what can happen. But one of the bigger challenges or a question that I struggle with is this whole idea of funding, in terms of, particularly in India, finding organizations. And I've been trying to actually find an organization where I can actually, move to get associated with in the long term, where we are able to make these changes happen in real time on ground. So I do not, as in, it would be nice to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, funding is, thank you, Divya. So funding is, I think, the most critical aspect, right? So even before a project comes into fruition, it is based on how economically viable this space is, or why do we need to spend this money on something which we can spend on something else. So always this cost benefit analysis of why we need something is, it really depends on how we sort of paint this picture of why this is critical. And that brings me to the point of different ways of funding, which is not just city budgets, which is critical, but also foundations through nonprofits that can provide grants and bonds and property tax and tax revenue allocation districts. All these can sort of make it possible to see these spaces as not just something that the city has to initiate and promote, but with the help of nonprofits and foundations that provide grants, or even local institutions that can partner with the space to provide necessary, like staffing or maintenance related, like oversight. So an institution that is really well off can definitely adopt a couple of spaces and make it public and make sure that it is maintained and programmed round the clock. And also looking at different ways of raising money through that space. And I'm not talking about just crowdfunding, but how can it be self-sustained, right? So how can the space itself become economic generation tool? And this is not just what the concept of development is and how that development doesn't really fit with everyone's needs, but this is more into tapping into local assets and tapping into what the local businesses really think can be built on their neighborhood. So I think that buy-in is definitely critical.
I think to add on to what Dhanya said, also critically in India, you technically have a lot of CSR funds that go, unutilized, and this is common for all cities. Like we have enough and more number of tech companies that are there. They all have their CSR funds, which they are entitled to, spend for any social responsibility kind of work. If Divya, if you are looking to start an organization, or you end up with an organization, I think it's critical to be able to use such kinds of funds, which end up being used for, say, they do one speed breaker in front of their building, and that's about how they use their CSR funds. So then just being able to creatively use these funds is also another aspect of how we can use it in India.
And thank you both.
Hello.
Sorry, just to complete the thought, Divya, you may also want to consider, joining forces with Placemaking India. At the moment, we are a collective learning agenda, but there's no reason why going forth we couldn't team up, because there's so many disciplines that make up this collective, and possibly raise funds through various sources, crowdfunding and other sources, and also following the principles that Dhanya very, very nicely sort of outlined, which is stakeholder involvement, getting stakeholder buy-in and involvement so that it becomes sustainable. So that's something you might want to consider doing, Divya, and anybody else on this.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Absolutely, we'll touch base on that.
Yeah, just to add on to that, even in New York, there has been talks about like how parks and libraries are going to be the first things to be cut during a budget proposal, and one of the ways to leverage it has been to bring it as a public health aspect instead of just parks and recreation. So they have been trying to involve public health experts and experts who are ecologists to be part of this conversation, so that their representation sort of increases that visibility of that space as critical.
Harshita had a question. Harshita, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Hi, Dhanya. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very insightful and very informative. I just had a question regarding one picture you had put up about the artwork by Ugly Indian. I have a question related to the public artwork of that sort. I just want to understand, so especially whatever Ugly Indian does, as in I've been traveling and watching what they've been doing, whatever the pillars, painted pillars, I travel through the same streets actually. So having seen that, definitely they brighten up the space and all of that, but I don't know how far it is binding the community together. How are we interpreting that as an aspect of binding the community together? And second thing, I also want to understand in terms of the impact that such artwork leaves. How do we even measure these impacts, and how do we understand how much benefits have we achieved by doing something like that? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you, Harshita. That's that's actually a constant point of contention, because that is also a very key point you raised, because we don't just want to see, aesthetic beautification, paint, and just like, those are simple quick fixes. And that is also a part of, the creation of murals for activating a space that is blighted or derelict is also part of activation in terms of placemaking, but it has to eventually lead to something bigger, and that's reform, and that's policy based, and that's creating more from that space. So now that you have the attention of people through these paintings, how can you start to now reimagine these places, and how can we integrate urban infrastructure underneath it to become spaces that can actually just serve a function, instead of just having a nice to have selfie point or whatever. So it's basically creating these idea of looking at public spaces as like areas to integrate resource hubs, integrate safety and information portals. So if you do that, immediately the role of these spaces become more than just a paint that you do. But what it has done, it has sort of brought that conversation to the forefront. And I'm not saying that this is the right way or the wrong way, but I'm saying that this is a way, and someone is doing it. And the BBMP sort of partnered with them to do this. So I hope the BBMP can see the value of this and not just say, okay, let's paint. Because I believe until they got that fund, the crowdfunding was raised by them creating bake sales. So very clearly there is no buy-in. So the city has to be more invested. We need to see more than just like murals on the wall. But when it comes to spaces like Kannagi Nagar, that has created a space. It has created an experience for people to reimagine Kannagi Nagar as more than just a slum. So there, the mural worked. So that's just this very, very tiny difference, but it makes a huge difference in the way we look at spaces and look at murals in general when we talk about placemaking. So thanks for the question.
Just to follow up on that, I also wanted to know, so you said Kannagi Nagar, it worked. Like, I know how it was a slum. I've seen Kannagi Nagar as well. So I was just wondering how are we even measuring or tabulating the benefits or the impact? Like, I just want to know the process of analyzing the impact actually.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%, because when we go to the city and do a cost benefit analysis, we need to show value, evaluate the value of a space. And usually our values only are determined by economic values. What are we getting in terms of monetary benefits? But if the officials are willing to look at reports and studies that have clearly suggested that neighborhood revitalization or bringing people together to collectively do something has been shown to reduce involvement in crime, for example, has been shown to drastically reduce the school dropouts or something like that. So you can make a like evaluation based on a period of time. So which is why the testing phase is really critical, because that is when you evaluate the space to see how many more people have entered into Kannagi Nagar that do not belong to Kannagi Nagar. So really, some organizations should have a count of this, and should sort of like have a record of all these things. And without data, all of our suggestions are just like anecdotes. So I think moving from anecdotes to data can make a greater point in accruing funds, like Divya suggested, and even like sort of seeing what changes have really been visible and also invisible, because we almost always forget the intangible benefits of these things, and how vacant spots, having just a couple of green areas, can reduce heart rates and increase the property values of the surrounding area. So things like these, they have research done. We just don't use it as a way to communicate our data and tools to government officials. So I think that gap between research and academic and applying them in real practice is also something for the future to definitely look forward to.
Thank you so much, Dhanya.
And I can definitely send you those articles of those metrics and data evaluation that people have done for, like public art and things like that.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. So I think I'm going to also share the Google Excel sheet that I've been working on, so everyone can share it with your own circles, and you will be duly credited in whatever output this comes into being. So it's in the chat box, so please feel free to share it with your friends, because I know that a lot of you are in India, and so it's probably easier for you to know what spaces have become what, and I just go off of internet and what I read. So yeah, this will be really useful, and I'm happy to sort of have this conversation personally with anyone else who's doing similar work as well.
It would be very interesting for, say, Dr. Galot to contribute from, what's happening in Jaipur. Priyank, maybe you can add on to it from what you know of Vadodara and the other participants, from your respective cities. And and by the way, if you think you can add value or a unique perspective to any of these sessions, please get in touch with me. I'm putting my email on this. If you want to get involved with Placemaking India, please let me know. And that's my email. There are a core 40 people, a core group of 40 of us, but obviously we're looking to double and do more things, get people from more diverse disciplines and from other parts of the country as well. So yeah, do let me know. And if you know of somebody, if there is a theme you'd like to explore, if you'd like to learn more about, let me know that as well. Yeah, and that's Dhanya's email ID as well on the chat. Is there anybody else who has a question? Would anybody else like to say anything? So if not, yeah, Dr. Galot.
Yeah, I just really appreciate the effort doing by the design trust, especially Dhanya and your efforts.
I really
and I'll definitely be happy to be part of it. This action force working in this field of placemaking, and looking to the post-COVID situation, it has become more relevant in Indian context, because in the lockdown period, people have regained the importance of the place where they have completely locked down in their houses. So they have come to know the value of their neighborhood places and how to develop them. So these placemaking techniques, tactical design would definitely help in developing the new era of humanity and urbanization, not only in the urban housing and street planning, especially in urban mobility also. Looking to the urban mobility, we have used some example of tactical designing and placemaking example in urban mobility in traffic management, and it is doing very well. So definitely with support of the Design Trust and Dhanya and effort of Nita, definitely will have a lot of expertise, and definitely we have broad spectrum to deal with.
Yeah.
Actually, I wondered, since you're with the government of Rajasthan, I just wondered if there was any initiative in response to Mohua's, advisory to pedestrianize streets. Is that happening in Jaipur? Is that something you've taken on board? Because I know some cities. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Jaipur is taking lead in pedestrianization and making the things more workable for pedestrians. So Jaipur is the only city which has taken a note of this particular problem, making place for pedestrian on road especially. So they have removed the footpaths in major bazaars, like major uh, old city area part, and the murals and paintings have been done along the walls in the old city part, just to make the pedestrian more attractive toward the inner part of the area, and just to lay their vehicle outside the old city part, so they can just move with the rickshaw, and using active mode they can move in the old part of the city area. So you must aware of the geography of the Jaipur city, which is localized. The old city part is localized in the inner walled city. So it's very congested area where very difficult to park your vehicle and move in the city with your vehicle, especially four wheeler. So government has just providing the activities like battery operated cycle rickshaw and some other active modes to commuters, so they can move in the city area with the minimize restrictions.
Thanks for sharing, sir. I have a question about that too. So, has there been any discussion on making these streets like a more permanent open streets concept, or like has there been discussion on sort of keeping them the way it is after the lockdown ends as well, based on the
Yeah,
rest?
definitely it will be taken up in the urban planning agenda after the COVID-19. Right now, it is not in the priority, definitely, looking to the situation. But in coming days, it will be in top priority after declaring the Jaipur as a world-class city. And it has been, in our part, has been earmarked with the UNESCO as a heritage structure. So definitely people are uh, thinking to make it more uh, community-based activities. Definitely, it will be part of planning in coming days, not in this year. Definitely after the as the period of COVID-19 will pass, definitely will switch to these things. Definitely.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you,
So,
sir. And I think it's also amazing that, this is happening. I don't want to call COVID-19 an opportunity where, we've taken a right turn to like so many different aspects of city life, street life, just being able to, there are so many cities who are giving ample importance to pedestrians, to cyclists, to, creating infrastructure for them, creating public spaces which are important. And I think it's great that Mr. Gehlot is actually part of this entire, core team of getting this done.
Thank you.
Actually, as a tourist destination, I think you have every interest in pedestrianizing the area, because also because of the heritage status of Jaipur. I just wondered what happens to other cities. I mean, Bangalore is a case where there's been a lot of advocacy from one of our Placemaking India founding members to actually pedestrianize 3 streets, and there's a campaign on. But the administration is probably so immersed in containing the pandemic that they haven't paid attention to this advisory, and they've not taken the initiative to assign this to anybody, or to make this happen. And so there's a lot of push from NGOs and others to identify three streets
Deepak,
and
we're not able to hear
make
you
them.
clearly.
I said I was citing the specific example of Bengaluru, where the city government has been too busy with containing the pandemic to pay attention to the advisory. And so I just wondered what should be the solution in such cases, because there's a clear link between air pollution and immunity. So it's not just a short-term thing of, I mean, the opportunity is there to reset the way we, live our lives because of COVID. And the government seems to think, okay, that's not a priority because they're interested in lives and not bicycles. So, I'd like to, maybe Dhanya or anybody else might want to give their opinion on this. How do we get, maybe they should assign this, or, assign this to another agency to do, instead of the civic body taking on so much. And should the national government be thinking more laterally and thinking ways to, to assign this responsibility for pedestrianization to, to other bodies?
Yeah, I think Pavithra and Priyank and a lot of others here might be like better at understanding how these could work. But my 2 cents about it is that public infrastructure like bicycles, it requires a really long understanding of like what the people experience in terms of hardships while using that infrastructure, and what initial introductory ways of practicing following the lane, for example. So those kind of things need to be a learning curve, and it cannot obviously happen at once. So where the civil society can be useful, or NGOs or design organizations can be useful, is in sort of providing this liaison sort of a role where they can bridge that communication gap, or like make sure that the cycle access is reaching everybody and not just the main streets, but more importantly, places where people cannot work from home, so, and they have to travel back and forth from their space of work to their home. So I think identifying these routes and then sort of asking the government to like make it into a longer term can be a better idea. But most often I think when you have, at least when I've like worked on such projects, it feels like when you have a solid understanding and community buy-in, and then you go to the government for sort of pitching that, it works better than to like suggest a grand idea and have them do it from scratch and with no basis to your claims. So I think that could be one of the reasons why it's taking time, because we need shaded bicycle lanes. We need better roads to be able to safely ride on bicycles. So there are a lot of different things that are basic for which we need to sort of build towards a more holistic bicycle planning facility, which I think it's happening in a lot of places in India. But yeah, Pavithra, because you worked with street plans, I know that you have done these kind of testing extensively.
Sure, I think it's a double-ended sword, at least in India. Like, I mean, I think it's in most places, but it's a double-ended sword in India because one, I kid you not, like in the last 8 months, I have done an observational study of how many people, at least in Chennai and in Bombay, who have been using cycles, right? Like, so every time you step out, you will, I'm not talking about the COVID situation. Before that, now, every time, you'll at least find like a couple of cyclists who are doing this for livelihood purpose, not recreational, not somebody who's doing this for fitness purpose, but primarily for getting to work. And one is before, maybe there is this sweet spot, it's a chicken and egg situation, what do you do first? But beyond that, it's also the fact that you are able to create an environment where cycling is normal. And I know that the first question that's asked immediately after you say cycling is the weather conditions and, what is surrounding it. And people don't want to go, sweating to work and all of that. But on the flip side of it, there are enough number of incentives that you can provide, A, to say corporate people, B, to people who are just going to get their grocery runs. So, just being able to like look at different aspects of, mobility itself to inject how people can start using other modes of travel. That is not your car or a bike or any kind of a private vehicle that uses gas, diesel, whatever. So I think it's about creating that base number of people who are using it. And at the same time, it's amazing, for example, how ITDP has been, steadfast in getting this, outrolled in, like, they're getting more number of cities right now. That's their current campaign where they're getting a lot of cities to come out, say that they want to do this cycling infrastructure, and therefore, be able to roll that out as a long-term thing with or without the COVID-19. So like I said, the virus situation itself is a good sharp turn to see how these things turn out. But I think we have a long way to go, and there is a sweet spot between these two situations, like where we have to increase the number of people who are riding, as well as start creating the infrastructure and not wait for everybody to come on the road and then start building the infrastructure.
Yeah, that idea of having parallel things happening, like you can have testing, but at the same time you can think about a larger scale policy is very important point you raised there, because it has to happen in parallel. We can't just be like, okay, now we have done this, let's do something else. So we need to build towards a bigger phase after testing and prototyping, which is very necessary.
Pavithra, we can't hear you, Pavithra.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, now I think like slowly all cities have also started rolling out. The smart city program has also like given way for this NMT. It's taken a long time for it to take shape, but it's great. It has, like, in some form or the other, they have taken steps towards creating that kind of a space where we have cyclists, creating a kind of a space where, it's huge in my opinion. Like, I'm not even joking. I think 10 years back, before I went on to do my master's or anything, I don't think I could have imagined a public statement from, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs to say that, they have to pedestrianize public markets. And I think just that conversation beginning is such a brilliant thing that's happened right now. And I hope, fingers crossed, that we are not turning back from here, and we have so much creativity, and what tactical urbanism at the end of the day is our jugaad, and we do it day in and day out, in various forms and formats. And I think it's just being able to tap onto so many of these creative outlets to be able to make our cities more sustainable in a very creative form, like even if it does not follow the rhythm that most Western cities followed.
Yeah, that's really exactly what I wanted to say too, because that we are quite creative in our own ways, and our placemaking is literally what we don't have to program spaces, because activities happen naturally in our streets. So it's like tapping onto these assets, but giving room to this and giving more space for this to happen. That's something that is necessary, and also for people to know that they need these kind of permits or these kind of legal impediments in their way in order to have a public event or in order to build a parklet, or like they need to know that there are these steps leading to something that you can do on your own, which could also be a great activity to sort of figure out what are the different actors involved in creating one simple sidewalk or one simple temporary bike lanes, on how citizens can be able to tap into those information and resources and do this and sort of suggest it or propose them to the government with a plan, like an easy permit basically. So I think that is also very necessary in bringing that public buy-in and transparency into the process. So I 100% agree with you, Pavithra.
Would anybody else like to contribute or react? Feel free. If not, I think it's exactly an hour. Thank you so much for so brilliantly summing up, and so well illustrated as well. The issues that you've described, public space management, and Pavithra also for really very responsively moderating. Next week, around the same time, we will have Nidhi Gulati from the Project for Public Spaces on Urban Jam, and I'd encourage you all to log in. She's an extremely lucid and very authoritative sort of source, and among our diaspora, she really stands out as as a leader, and she's going to be talking about the gender equity, like how to redress the gender imbalance in transport and planning, city planning. That's a fascinating subject, and she's got some great ideas from Latin America and elsewhere, and she'll be sharing the 10 top ideas for India. So there'll be a poster going out, and we'll be promoting it a little more widely because we have more time now. It's going to be the third of the series. I hope we'll have many more. And if any of you have suggestions for people who can come on, and we want to spread the word a little more, that would be great. Really look forward to continuing this into the next few months. So thank you again. Thanks all of you. Thanks Pavithra. Thanks Dhanya. And if you can send us the recording, that would be great. We'll put it up on our yeah, we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. We have a Placemaking India YouTube channel, so we'll put it up on that.
Yeah, and thank you all for being here and participating in the conversation, and Vinita and Pavithra for having this happen, making this happen. It's very timely, and I hope we have more such conversations that can spark ideas. And yeah, I'm happy to be part of this network in the future as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope you'll be you'll be mentoring us. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.